Even if you feel extremely ready to jump off the table and start running, take the time to do your pre-trip check by making sure you can tolerate those increased weight-bearing forces. Thank you for tuning in this week. This is your host, Dr. Dillon Caswell. In today's episode, we're going to learn how to appropriately progress your rehab program from table exercises to standing while keeping weight-bearing forces in mind. It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it. Today's show is sponsored by the Rehab app. This is not just an app, but a solution. You have the opportunity to take control of your rehab, prehab, fitness, and performance needs all from the palm of your hand. The app is available for download on the App Store for both Apple and Android users. Also, a free 7-day trial is available. Don't wait. Start taking control of your movement health today. Prehabbers, welcome back to the show. Growing up, my family and I lived out in the country. My brother and I saved up a bunch of money by doing chores and odd jobs to buy ourselves a dirt bike. We probably spent more time fixing and trying to get the dirt bike to start than we did actually riding it. But in any case, we did have a friend over once who was really excited to hop on the dirt bike and take it for a spin. He told us that he has experience, he's done it before. So my brother and I were like, cool, he doesn't need any instruction. Go ahead, hop on it, take it for a ride. So he gets on this dirt bike. He's holding the clutch down and he has the throttle absolutely pinned down. This dirt bike is revving up. Instead of looking at this as a red flag or an alert, my brother and I got really excited. This guy's about to do something epic on this dirt bike. He's ripping a wheelie out of neutral. This is going to be sick. So he lets go of the clutch. Throttle stays pinned down. The dirt bike takes off. He did do a wheelie, which was pretty cool. But his legs flail out to the side. So imagine this guy holding onto the handlebars, basically doing a split in the air with his dirt bike just ripping across the yard. My brother and I start running after him to see what is he going to do next. That was so cool. What's the next thing he's going to do? So we follow. He goes a hard left turn and crashes into a bunch of trees in the woods. Falls off the dirt bike. We go running over. The dirt bike's still running. He's on the ground. He's yelling, "My leg's broken. My leg's broken." We get there, there's nothing sticking out. There's no blood. There's no deformities. There's a scratch. There's this little scratch on there. It was more of just a fear response that he had because that had to have been scary. But we started laughing and then realized that we probably should have taken the time to go through a step-by-step progression to make sure that he was set up for success instead of pinning the throttle down and crashing it into the trees. And that's what today's episode is really about, is how do we avoid that happening in our rehab programs. Specifically, we're going to be talking about weight-bearing forces going into the lower extremity, and we're going to get a little bit more specific with the hip joint just so that we can provide some better examples. So what are weight-bearing forces? Weight-bearing forces are what you take on when you're standing, when you're walking. When you're walking, for example, at the hip is taking on 5.5 times body weight of these weight-bearing forces, which is called the hip peak contact force. But we're just going to call it weight-bearing forces to make it a little bit more simple and a little bit more digestible throughout the rest of this episode. So in standing, we're taking on body weight forces. In a bilateral stance with both feet on the ground, we can say that it's somewhat near 50-50. Is it perfectly 50-50? No, you might be leaning to one side versus the other, but we'll just say it's near that 50-50. When you go to walk, one leg comes up in the air, the other one stays down. Now that side is taking on more body weight, which means the hip is taking on more contact forces because of the weight bearing that joint is taking on with that particular movement. What we want to talk about in this episode is how do you go from the table with exercises to getting back to an activity like walking or like running while grading this weight-bearing exposure. Because there's a couple ways that we can go about this. And to set it clear, let me give an example from the other side of this, that we can progress a particular muscle group. If we're trying to isolate a muscle that has become deconditioned or weak, we can isolate that. And by doing less movements in closed chain and more in open chain, that is a progression for that specific muscle group. Example here, someone injures their knee, they need some more quad strength. So we start off, maybe they're doing a wall sit, maybe they're doing a squat. In doing that, they have other muscles that are helping that activity out. It's not just the quad, the hamstrings, the adductors, the hip abductors, the core, the calf. All of these muscles are helping with that activity. Now, if we go to a sitting single leg extension, those other muscles aren't helping out anymore. That means that the force is all at the quad. So that is a progression when we're talking about specific exercises for a specific muscle group. But in this episode, what we want to focus on is weight bearing exposure, getting more weight bearing, more closed chain forces up through the lower extremity to get back to walking and running. And to paint that picture, we're going to provide two different examples. One is going to come from the sports world. I have had the honor of covering a lot of different sports on the sidelines with extremely gifted athletic trainers that have been amazing and have taught us so much and helped to change our perspective a bit on how to do a really fast assessment to make sure that the person is ready to get back into their sport, and how to build confidence up while doing that assessment so that when the athlete's back on the field, you're not a nervous wreck on the sideline wondering if they're going to get injured again. And then we're also going to come at it from an example of a provider working with a patient, or if you are a patient, you can use these progressions, or if you're having this pain, I should say, you can use these progressions to help yourself get back to the activity that you love, whether that be walking or running. So let's start in the sports world. In the sports world, the initial evaluation is to make sure that the ambulance doesn't need to be called. Was there a major collision? Was there an emergency? That the best way to care for this athlete is by getting emergency medical help. We're going to assume that all that's ruled out, that it is a musculoskeletal injury. There's no fractures. There's nothing alarming. We just want to now identify, how is this athlete getting off the field? And then once they're off the field, are they able to get back on the field? So let's say it's a rolled ankle that has happened, which is super common. Seen it very much in soccer and lacrosse and rugby and in football. See it all the time. So we'll use an ankle sprain as the example here. So we have an ankle sprain. There's not a lot of swelling. It's not fractured, but we want to see how much weight can they put onto this. And this is the game with inside the game, is that sometimes you can do a little bit longer of an evaluation because the team wants a break. And while you're doing the evaluation on the field, the team is getting that rest break. If the team you're working with has momentum, they probably want you to get this thing evaluated and get the athlete out of harm's way, back out onto the sidelines as quick as you can so that they don't lose the momentum. So there is a game with inside the game that I've learned from, again, really gifted athletic trainers. But let's say that you have the time to go through this quick assessment on the field. So the athlete goes down, it's an ankle sprain. You're working with them, you're trying to see how much weight can they put through this. If we have the time, we can sit here, we can cross the T's and dot our I's and build up confidence. On the field, can you push your foot into the ground while you're laying on the playing surface? So laying on your back, hook lying position, meaning the knees are bent, feet are on the ground. Can you push down into the ground? Is that bothersome? Yes, probably not going to tolerate a lot of weight in standing. No, let's add more force to it. Let's add more weight bearing force. How do we add more weight bearing force to this? Do a bridge for me. Just lift your hips up off the ground, let your foot and ankle take more weight, but we're not in standing. So there's not a lot of forces going through it, but there's more forces going through it than just pushing down. So push, lift those hips up. How does that feel? Does that feel okay? Okay, let's move to the next step. What's that next step? Let's go into a half kneeling position. Half kneeling, one knee down, other leg out in front. Think of like Tim Tebow in this position with that front leg. So the non-injured leg would be the knee that's down on the field. The injured leg would be the one that the knee is out in front and the foot is on the ground. So with that front leg, can you drive your foot into the ground, put some more weight into it? We now have the trunk being upright or up against gravity. So more forces are going down through that joint. Can you tolerate that? If you tolerate that, let's get up into standing. In standing, we have now more weight-bearing forces, more contact forces into the foot and ankle. Can you shift your weight side to side, front to back? How does that feel? That feels okay. All right, let's take a couple steps. How does that feel? Feels good. Okay, let's get off the field. Let's walk off the field at this point. Once off the field, we now have to assess, can they get back to running? Because most of these sports that we're referencing, they don't need to just walk. They need to get back. They need to run, jump, and cut. Walking is somewhere around 5 times body weight into these joints, where running is somewhere near 8 to 10 times body weight, if not more. So from walking, we can't assume that because they walked off the field, that they're ready to get back into it. So once we're off the field, let's keep adding more contact forces. Let's keep adding more of these weight-bearing forces. They walked off the field. We're off on the sidelines. Can you shift your weight over into a single leg stance? Can you do a single leg stance with a single leg deadlift, for example? Because now we're seeing, can you take force as your body's moving around that joint? From there, can you start to do a jog? Can you start to, after the jog, start adding some cuts in? After doing some cuts, can you do that at full speed? If you have to get back into, if it's a sport that involves jumping like volleyball or basketball, or if you're a position player in football, if there's jumping, well, let's see, can you tolerate jumping without having a ton of pain on it? Because if you're going back in, we don't want to be a nervous wreck on the sideline wondering when the next injury is going to happen, or if a quote unquote worse injury is going to happen, in the sense of you're favoring that side. So now you go to make a cut and now you have a more extreme injury that keeps you out of the game longer. So we have to weigh those pros and those cons. And another little kind of clinical pearl that I've learned from these amazing athletic trainers is that you don't have to be the one telling the athlete you're not going back in. It is a team decision, meaning that the coaches play a role in it as well. So I've worked with really great coaches that I've given them the information of, coach, I don't think the player's ready to go back in, but they're really fighting against us. And we need you to be the final decider for that. And the coaches have been awesome because they take that information. And we had this one football player who was fighting. I want to get back out there. I want to get back out there, which, side story, that is awesome. Those are the athletes that you want to work with. They want to fight to get back in there. They don't want to be part of the boo-boo bench. They want to get back into the sport because they love playing. They don't care that they're hurt. They don't care that they're in pain. They want to get out there and do what they were meant to do. That is awesome. But sometimes we have to protect them a little bit from themselves. So that was this particular player. He was not tolerating walking, was not tolerating running, and he was a positional player in football. He was a running back. They're like, coach, yeah, he's not ready to go, but he's not listening to us. So the coach goes, all right, come over. Hey, run this play out to the huddle for me. So the player's like, okay, got it. I'm ready to go. He limps his way out there and the coach immediately pulls him. And he was like, you couldn't even run out to the huddle. You're not going back in this game. Sit your butt over on the sidelines, cheer your team on, start doing what the medical staff and what the rehab staff is telling you, because they're going to get you back sooner if you just make this short-term sacrifice. So it's great when people are all on the same page and all on the same team. But anyway, drawing that back from that example, hopefully you were able to see this picture painted of adding these forces in and taking some of this guesswork out of it. But let's now come from the other example of someone that's coming in that has hip pain. So they weren't injured out on the field. We have a little bit more time to progress this rehab program. And let's say that they're dealing with just posterior lateral hip pain. They're dealing with a gluteal tendinopathy, super common. They want to get back into running. You have found that if it's you have found that I need more load tolerance in my hip joint, or I need to strengthen this area to accept these forces better. But when I run, it gives me pain that is unbearable and takes away from other activities in the day. So we need to start loading this joint, but at a level that the joint is tolerating it. And so let's say that for this particular scenario, that position is laying down on the table. It's side lying. And we'll use a typical exercise that people generally know, a clamshell. So they're on their side, they have the band around their knees, they're lifting that knee up, they're getting those posterior lateral hip musculature working, the deep external rotators. They're building up these muscles to be able to hopefully accept more weight-bearing forces when they're ready to tolerate that. The inspiration behind this episode is so many times we have seen people that have gone from the table to running without anything in between. And in doing that, there's setbacks. The athlete doesn't get back to the mileage that they want to get back to, and other injuries start popping up when we can do much better. So how do we do that? Let's grade the weight-bearing exposure to the hip joint. So we're starting with the clamshell. There's really no weight-bearing forces with this movement. So if they tolerate that, let's start adding more weight-bearing forces. What would that look like, adding more of a weight-bearing force from a clamshell? Well, maybe now we move into a bridge where the feet are pushing down on the table, the glutes are squeezing, they're lifting the hips up. We're starting to get some weight bearing into the leg, but we're only doing it from really the pelvis down because the upper body is supported and we're not taking on gravity. So we're not adding too much of a weight bearing force, but it's a progression from where they were at with a sideline clamshell. Within the bridge, you can add progressions of go ahead, lift your hips up and now shift side to side while you're holding that. You can progress to a hip thrust in which they're moving through a greater range of motion, where they're back supported on a bench and now they're coming up. You can progress that now into a staggered stance bridge, and then from a staggered stance into a single leg bridge. But in doing that, we're lightly progressing weight bearing forces, but we're still not getting the hip up against gravity in a way that it will be when the person is walking or running. So we need to also start building up that position. The beautiful thing of these progressions is that you have used them before when you learned how to move. This comes from neurodevelopmental sequences, sprinkled in with strength and conditioning principles, sprinkled in with rehab principles. So what does this look like? Well, from that position, let's add more contact force. Let's start to get up more against gravity. How do we do that? Let's go into a crawling position. In that crawling position, if you want to keep the clamshell or fire hydrant going, the leg that's staying down on the ground to provide that weight bearing force, that's the one that's taking in these peak contact forces as the other leg is kicking out to the side. In that position, we have 3 points of contact: right arm on the floor, left arm on the floor, left knee on the floor, and then the right leg kicking out to the side is not the point of contact, but those 3 weight bearing positions are 3 points of contact. We can now increase that to 2 points of contact with something like a bird dog. And in doing that, the leg that's down on the ground is the one that's getting more exposed to more contact area or more weight bearing forces. In that crawling position, we can keep progressing into something like a bear crawl or a leopard crawl, but the trunk is still horizontal. It's still not taking on all the forces that it's going to be taking when it's up against gravity. So let's progress that. Let's now go into a half kneeling position. Half kneeling, again, think of that Tim Tebow position, knee down, other foot out in front. The side that's down, the knee that's pushing down into the ground, that's our weight bearing side. That is now getting more of a progression, more weight bearing into that joint. We can do exercises here like a pail off press. We can rock forward onto that leg and come back off of it. We can rock side to side onto it, so we can get different forces in there. We can do a half kneeling overhead press, because now as you start to overhead press, you're adding more forces now from the upper body going down to the hip, and it's increasing the weight bearing progression of that joint. From there, now we want to get back into standing. Standing, we're now completely vertical up against gravity from our trunk. We added in now that the foot, ankle, knee, and hip are all taking in contact forces in a weight bearing position. Beautiful place to be if our goal is to get back to walking. And now in this position, we can start working on things like squats. We can start shifting weight to one side to the other side. But our goal from here is now to get to walking, and from walking to running, which means we need to work on single leg activity, because the faster that you run, the more single leg stability or the more time you spend in single leg stance. And that is our goal, is getting back to running. So we need more time in single leg stance. How do we progress to that? Well, from the standing position, we talked about staggered stances. So we can use staggered stances. We can start to now incorporate lunges, because the main difference between a split stance squat or a staggered stance squat and a lunge is you're stepping out and then stepping back to that position. So there's a step in which a brief period you're in a single leg stance. So we can use that to start build up toleration to then move into single leg positions. Once we're in single leg positions, there's single leg squats, there's single leg deadlifts, there's single leg pail off presses. There's all these things that you can do in single leg, but the takeaway is building up these weight bearing forces to single leg. Beautiful. You got the single leg stance down. Does that now mean that you are ready to go back into running? Potentially, but again, this episode is about not skipping steps. So let's make sure we don't skip those steps. When you are walking, that is about 5 times body weight of force that is being taken on. When you're in a single leg stance, that is not near 5 times your body weight. When you start to run, that now goes up to 10 times body weight, meaning that workload has now, at a minimum, it's doubled. Workload data has shown that when we double workload, that's when the athlete has a chance for an injury. So we got to be cautious of how much are we increasing this workload? And if we are increasing it, what's the data that we have that says that we can increase this? So what does this look like going from a single leg stance with the goal of getting back to running? So we talked about single leg stance going into walking. Walking is 5.5 times body weight. 5 times body weight. The nice progression between walking and running is a really well thought out plyometric program, because plyometrics will range anywhere between 5 to 8, I think it was 8.1, 5 to 8.1 times body weight forces of weight bearing that the hip is taking on. So building up a plyometric program now gets you ready and prepared to take on running. It also answers the question, well, what distance do I start at? Because maybe it's you want to run a 5K. Do I start off at a mile? Do I start off at 2 miles? Do I start off at 3 miles? Do I go until I can't go anymore? How do I do this when I'm trying to rehab my hip and get back to this activity that I love? And this is where it gets really cool and really fun, and where we can really just start to nerd out a little bit. The data is not perfect on this, but it tends to be that when a person runs a mile, there's 1,500 foot contacts, which breaks down to about 750 foot contacts per foot. With that being said, you can build up a plyometric program. The amount of foot contacts that are accepted, the amount that is tolerated with that plyometric program, now gives you the data of how far can this person start running, or how far can I start running if I'm doing this on my own. So let me give an example here. So we said 750 foot contacts per foot running a mile, which would be in total 1,500 foot contacts. Let's say the person is only able to tolerate 375 foot contacts per side. That would be equivalent to a ceiling of half a mile, meaning that when they're getting back into running, and that's the amount of foot contacts that are being accepted, we don't want to push past that half mile because we already have the answer. They're going to get sore. There's going to be a setback if we push too far past that. So maybe we start at a quarter mile. How did that go? Great. As they're doing the quarter mile, we start building up the plyometric program a little bit further. Now they're tolerating 750 foot contacts per side. Awesome. Now they're ready for a mile. And then we would keep progressing that to take the guesswork out of that. So hoping you enjoy that data that we can use to really become a little bit more calculated with our programming progressions and not, quote unquote, pin the throttle down and crash into the trees. So let's start wrapping up this episode. The main advice that we have is don't skip steps and pin the throttle down too fast. If you are progressing fast, that's okay. Just make sure that you have the data to show why you're progressing this fast. This helps to take the guesswork out of it. It limits setbacks and will hopefully help you to keep working towards your movement goals in a more calculated approach. Hoping you enjoyed that episode and got some clarity on how we can progress weight-bearing exercises to improve tolerance and resiliency to these activities, mainly in the lower extremity. But let's cover the key takeaways. Key takeaway number 1, by crossing our T's and dotting our I's, we can have more confidence in progressing our programs instead of relying on guessing and hoping that it works out. Key takeaway number 2, even if you feel extremely ready to jump off the table and start running, take the time to do your pre-trip check by making sure you can tolerate those increased weight-bearing forces. Key takeaway number 3, we live very fast-paced, and I get it. I tend to be a full send guy myself, but a calculated full send. By being a bit more calculated with our programming progressions, we then know when, where, and why we're hitting that full send button. Rehabbers, thank you for listening, viewing, and being part of this podcast. If you want to further support this work, ratings and reviews are the way, as it helps more people to find this content. We are honored to have you part of this podcast and have your support in this important mission. All right, we'll talk to you soon.